It should. I guess we're live. Usually it says 3, 2, 1. Well, anyway, this is James Hudnall, and I'm here with Val Mayerik, as promised. We got our problems sorted out. I just got to set up my my alternate page here, my screen, so I can catch any comments that come in. Where are you? There it is. I'm just going to make sure the volume gets turned down.
Hold that right there. I'm going to be right back. I got to get a cup of tea. I'll just be.
Oh, okay. I can talk while you're there. All right. So we are now live, and Val just had to go grab something. So I just want to go over all kinds of stuff about his career. He's been an accomplished comics artist, starting out with Marvel. He also worked with Neil Adams at Continuity Studios, and he also shared studio space with people like Howard Chaykin. He has a very interesting and storied career that goes back many years. So, hi, there you are. So, how are you, Val?
I'm good. I'm fine.
Good. When did you get started in the industry?
It was in 1972. I was attending a kind of a backwater university in Youngstown, Ohio. It actually wasn't that bad of a university as far as their technical school was concerned. That had a great engineering department and a good geology department, but the art department was pathetic. And I spent most of my time in the drama department because I liked acting and I liked doing theater. And I was in my 4th year. I wasn't anywhere near graduating. I still needed a lot of credits. I was in a painting class with speaking with another student who was also a comics reader and fan. And a woman, she was, at the time, she seemed like an older woman because she was like 35. She was coming back to school to finish her degree so she could teach. And she was listening to me and this other guy talking about comics. And she said, do you guys know who Dan Adkins is? And I said, yeah, he's an inker. And she said, well, he just lives about a mile away from me, down in East Liverpool, Ohio. And I was astonished to hear this. And I got a little more information from her regarding Dan, where he lived and his address and his phone number. And I wasn't about to have any prospects by attaining a degree from this university, and I knew it. So I thought, well, this is it. I mean, this is an opportunity I can't pass up. I didn't know anything about Dan. I didn't know if Dan really could do anything for me, but I just took a chance, got together a bunch of art that I had, some drawings and some comics I just did on my own. And I went out down to East Liverpool, Ohio, which was about a 60-mile drive. And when I got there, Dan was, Dan, I don't know if you knew anything about Dan, but Dan was a very eccentric, odd individual. And he told me that Craig Russell was working with him as well. P. Craig Russell, the P. Craig, Eisner Award winner Russell. And so I moved down to East Liverpool.
Uh-oh. Looks like it's stuttering.
Somewhere there. Craig and I would be ready to submit our samples to Marvel. We did. Roy Thomas gave us work. It was astonishing. It was just that easy. We then, about a month later, took a Greyhound bus ride to New York City, went up to Marvel. It was only like 1 floor or half of a floor of a building on Madison Avenue. There was very few. I mean, it was a small place, but there were so many people there. I mean, it was such a buzz with activity because this is way pre-digital days. So all the original art was there: the pencils, the Gil Kane pencils, the inks by Sal Buscema, people doing copy editing and color. Anyway, they were coloring, and they weren't coloring the way they color now.
No, they colored. They cut out little color. They're clear. They're like clear cellophane in different colors, and they laid it on.
They were doing some of that, but they were color coding it. Like Severin was coloring there, and they would color things with a Dr. Martin's dyes, but it was real. They would color onto photostats of the original black and white art, and it was sloppy, kind of coloring, it didn't look at all like it would look when it was printed. And you wonder, well, how the hell, what's that happening? And basically it was just that there was a code the printer had. So if it was a burnt sienna color that was coming out of the bottle at the office at Marvel, then they would write a number, a code number for that, and the printer knew what that number was, and then he would print it accordingly. So all the colors came out, even
it was all code. Yeah, it was all code based back then, pretty much.
Yeah. So we had a good time in New York. Roy Thomas took us out to lunch. We met Stan. We met John Romita, and that was it. That was the beginning. And I worked for Marvel steadily for about 20 years from that point on.
Wow. And you, I think, well, how did you meet Steve Gerber? Was he there? Did you work with him before Howard the Duck?
Well, yeah, I worked with Steve on Man-Thing.
Right, of course.
Pardon?
Oh, I say of course because that's where Howard the Duck appeared.
Yeah. I got into comics primarily because I wanted to do sword and sorcery. I wanted to do Conan. But when I got into the business, Barry Smith was doing Conan, and Smith was really hot then. He was doing a lot of interesting work. Thomas loved Smith, and there was no chance of me doing Conan. So they actually kind of created, or they plumbed the minds of barbarian literature, and they came up with Thongor, who was written, I forget who the author was, but he wasn't anywhere near as popular as Howard, but he was writing characters similar to that. And so I did a Thongor comic for a while. That died. I worked on the classic monsters, The Mummy, Frankenstein, and then they just called and said, "Would you like to do Man-Thing?" And Steve Gerber's writing it, so I said, "Yeah, sure." And they sent me some of the previous work that had been done by Mike Plug, and I think Rich Buckler. And so I started on Man-Thing, and that's how I got to working with Steve. And at that point, I had not even yet met Steve, I don't think, in person. I think we just spoke on the phone.
Hmm. And you worked over his continuity, didn't you?
Pardon?
You worked with Neil Adams at Continuity for a while?
That was much, much later. I was still living in Ohio when I began working on Man-Thing, and when Howard the Duck was invented, when it was created. I was still in Ohio. I didn't move to New York for another good 4 years, I think. And I got to, in regard to Neil, I got to New York. Was getting some work, but it wasn't satisfactory. And I really, New York even then was expensive and quite intimidating. And I felt I better do something to get a really good, steady flow of income, and also to meet other artists and see what's going on and get my foot deeper, further in the door in the business. And so when I went to Continuity, actually I'd been to Continuity earlier than that. When I was still living in Ohio, Dan and I and Craig, I think we had taken another trip to New York, and we went to Continuity and met Neil. And Neil always said, "I like your stuff. I'd like to ink it someday. And if you ever move to New York, stop by." And of course I did. And it was great working there. Neil, threw a lot of work to a lot of guys who were work, and Neil, taught us really how to do a decent job, in terms of storyboards, comics. Really improved my draftsmanship, really improved my sense of laying out a page and so forth. And Neil was not like an instructor, sort of mentor. He didn't really take that position or play that role. But if you were around there long enough, just by osmosis, you were going to be picking up a lot of really great information and, getting some good direction on where to go with your work.
Yeah, that was the place to be back then. I mean, there were so many artists that went through there. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it was a Parnassus. I mean, this is, again, way, way before the digital age. And so if you wanted to meet, really, artists that you admired or got people that were big in the business, you stopped by Continuity and you hung out there. And, I mean, geez, what's his name? Sergio Aragonés stopped by there whenever he was there from Europe. Mobius, Giraud, all those guys, all those European artists that were doing all that work in heavy metal, that was all that great stuff. They were hanging out at Continuity. all the people that were anybody that was anybody in that day and age was working or at least associated in some way with the continent. Jim Starlin, anybody you can think of, Joe Rubenstein. Everybody was hanging out there, working there, and it was a lot of fun. It was just a great dynamic. There was some tension there. There were people there that didn't agree necessarily with Neil's approach to things, or there were people there that were trying to suck up to Neil, and it was interesting watching the drama take place.
Yeah, imagine. So, did you talk to Stan that much?
Stan Lee?
Yes, Stan Lee.
Not a lot, but well, first of all, I'm trying to think of how to chronologically. When I first moved to New York City, I had only been there a couple of months, and they asked me to do a cover for Savage Sword of Conan, and it was they wanted a painted cover, and I like painting. I've always, that's what I do now mostly is paint. So I painted this cover. I turned it in. I painted it in oil, and I thought that was that. And then when the book came out, I could see that they had given the cover to another artist who painted over it. He just painted over the entire figure of Conan with acrylics. I had painted in oil, and you could see the difference. They gave it to Earl Norham, who is in and of was a good solid illustrator himself, but the two styles were so different, and I thought it looked like such a hackneyed job. And it really, I felt that they could have, if they needed changes, they could have asked me to do it. I was living right there in the city, and I was steamed. So I went up to the offices, and there was no security to get past in those days or any such thing. I just got off the elevator and walked to Stan's office. And Stan was sitting there with his feet up on his desk, and he says, "Yes, Val, what can I do for you?" I said, "Well, what's this?" And I went into this whole diatribe about my painting, and why didn't you call me, and why didn't you ask me, and I could have done this, and don't you like my work? Why Earl Norham? And Stan just very patiently listened to me, and then he said, "So Val, how do you find New York? You like it?" And he just totally deflected me. He didn't even try to take issue with anything I was saying. He came off as this guy who wanted to know if I liked New York. Was I still having a good time working for Marvel? I said, "Well, yeah." So he threw me totally off balance, took the wind out of my sails, in my anger sails, and he then just told me he apologized for that. He said, "Well, from now on, if we ever need, if you do another cover and we need you to do some alterations on it, we'll definitely get in touch with you. So sorry about that." And that was that. I mean, he was so diplomatic about it. He was so professional and so cool about it. And after so many years in the business, I'm sure he knew how to deal with, disgruntled artists. And so that was my last, significant interpersonal contact with Stan. But as a result, he remembered me because of that. And so years and years later, we were at a convention in Chicago, and Stan was talking to me and a lot of other artists who worked for Marvel. And I asked him if he actually did remember me, or if he's just kind of one of these guys that just claims he knows all the artists. And he said, "No, he remembers." And he told me about that. He said, "I remember you barging into my office, being that was where that was."
Yeah, you're freezing sometimes. I guess it's because of the storm. So just so you know, he's in the middle of a big storm, and sometimes there's a lag. It gets in the way.
Yeah, it could be. It could be.
But it's 20 years at Marvel. So you worked through the 80s and 70s and 80s, I guess.
Right. And into the early 90s for a short time. Yeah.
And then you never did any DC work?
I did one DC. I'm sorry. I did two DC jobs. One, when I was in New York working at Continuity, a job came into Continuity from DC. It was a Jonah Hex job. And at that time, there was a mythical, or kind of a group of guys called the Krusty Bunkers, which were
Oh, yeah.
basically just a compendium of artists, you know, in continuity, who were some penciling, some inking, Neil basically overseeing it. I think they expected this Jonah Hex job to be a Krusty Bunkers job, but some of those guys were gone and Neil didn't have the time, so they gave the job to me. So I penciled a Jonah Hex job. I forget who inked it, but it was inked well. It was not a bad looking job. And then about 2 years before that, I did a job of a woman character. She reads tarot cards and tells fortunes, Madame Xanadu.
Right.
And I think those were the only 2 DC jobs I ever did.
Huh. And you did Void Indigo with Steve at Epic.
Yeah. Yeah.
That book had quite a reaction because it came out during, there was like this whole retailer scare going on around that time where retailers were afraid of, well, they had legitimate reasons to, like state, local, and mostly local governments were terrorizing comic book stores and looking for excuses to shut them down, treating them like they were porn stores. So any comic book that was remotely adult could get them into trouble. And Void Indigo kind of covered some, you know, by today's standard, it was nothing, but back then it was kind of a little risque because it was an adult comic. I guess Steve wanted to try something outside of the restrictions of, well, this is what Epic was for. But I happened to be at a retailer convention. I was actually a distributor convention for Glenwood Distributors, which didn't exist a year later. But they had a convention, and all their customers were at this convention. They were all retailers, and they were just screaming at Carol Kalish, who was the marketing person. And just like they were holding up their copy and just, man, they were just, and poor Steve, he was there at the convention, and he was pretty dejected by that.
Yeah, it was. I look back on it now, and I can't, for the life of me, see what people got so upset about. There was nudity.
Yeah,
that female nudity. There was some pretty intense violence.
There was a trans person, a trans prostitute, which for the time was pretty cutting edge, I guess, for comics. But I mean,
and that character didn't even appear in the graphic novel. It was the 2 comics that followed afterwards. Yeah.
That's when they were. That's what they were reacting to, the miniseries. But I just, you know, that's the first time I got to sit down and talk to Steve Gerber, and got to know him then. And he was not in the best moods at the time. I don't blame him.
Well, you know, the in terms of the people that you were saying they were after the distributors, I was invited to a show in Toronto, a convention in Toronto, shortly after the graphic novel had been released. I got to the show. They put me on a one-man panel and grilled me about they made Canada some big. There were some crates of comics, among them Void Indigo, which were coming up into Toronto, and they turned them away at the border, and that's how upset they got about it. They kind of put me up there on this panel and wanted me to explain all this, and I said, "Look, I'm the artist. I illustrated what Steve wrote. I didn't find it that objectionable at the time. Had I found it objectionable, I wouldn't have drawn. I wouldn't have, illustrated it." And they weren't really hostile, but I think they were just absolutely nonplussed. They were perplexed. Like, what in the world are these Americans doing that we can't see? It was interesting.
The early days of comics was sort of like a Wild West scenario almost, except we weren't shooting each other, but it was crazy. I was there. And it
Well,
was,
Steve writes about what is on his mind. He writes about what pisses him off. And if you follow the next three comics of Void Indigo, or I think the two comic book issues that followed, it's all about the underbelly of LA, because Steve was living and working in LA at the time in animation, and he hated it. He just thought LA was full of a bunch of bullshit, phonies, and the bullshit, Hollywood lifestyle stuff. He was sick of all of that. And Steve is not one to be shy to express his opinion regarding these things. And that's what, if you see, it's really coming down on LA. It's more than LA noir. It's like LA hatred. So.
Yeah, I know the feeling. I lived there for a while myself, and unlike him, I didn't work as much in the industry. I had a lot of interfacing with the industry, the movie industry. As Steve worked in animation, and he had to put up with a lot of, standards and practices.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people in animation back then. I was friends with a lot of them, and the stories that I would hear were, it's just you would have to really love animation to work in there, and they did pay, but there was so much crap you had to put up with that I don't think I could have done it. I mean, it would have been just too frustrating for me.
He told me a couple of stories about some of the limitations and like you say, standards and practices, whatever that meant. One of the really absurd scenarios was that you could not, and I forget what show he was writing for, but it was kind of a sword and sorcery type character. And you could not, or maybe it wasn't, but it was some kind of a hero character. And you couldn't actually have anybody hit somebody. They could not put that on the air because kids are watching. So you couldn't hit somebody with your fist, but you could throw a building on top of them to kill them. So, and this kind of stuff, this kind of, contradiction just drove Steve up the wall.
Yeah, especially G.I. Joe cartoons. They had to figure out these ways of stopping the bad guys without shooting them,
Yeah.
They had to come up with these goofy, and the same thing with a lot of other things. That's where the 70s especially, but late 70s, early 80s, when they were coming up with stuff like the Smurfs, they were trying to be like just harmless kind of goofiness.
Right, cuddly, cozy, warm and cozy, yeah, warm and fuzzy.
Yeah, that's, the Smurfs were popular. I don't know why, but that was the direction. I mean, for me, the reason I became a writer, but I also had sort of set my mindset when at a very early age. When I was a little kid, it was they were still doing kind of violent cartoons on TV, like Johnny Quest or whatever. And then because of the Vietnam War, and there was all these parent groups saying we have to stop all violence in comic and cartoons.
Yeah.
So they started pushing these really crappy cartoon stories on kids, and I was just really turned off and angered by it because they were just destroying the stuff that I enjoyed, because I was enjoying those. I was I was just a little kid, but every year when they would come out, they had this double-page spread in the comic books that would show you what the NBC cartoons for that year were going to be, and they started being lamer and lamer looking.
Yeah.
And like they had banana splits, which I really despised. I was so angry because I don't like being talked down to. Even when I was a kid, I don't like people talking down to me. I just felt like it was just insulting my intelligence. And so it made me, from that point on, for the rest of my life, just anti-censorship, anti-authoritarian kind of, you do not tell me what I can like type. That's why I just don't like any of the PC stuff, because I just don't like anyone trying to impose their views, which tend to be really ridiculous and stupid half the time. Anyway, people that are authoritarians, their view of reality is just, it's just not very realistic. So
Yeah, well, it's one thing to have an editorial policy, which every publisher has a right to have, but it's another thing to literally reach out so far into controlling what goes into the culture and trying to please any potential person who might protest. Pandering to someone who hasn't even protested yet, but they're afraid they might protest. So we dare not deal with, we dare not upset people that might be angry with us. It's hard to deal with that.
Yeah, being a kid, I didn't have any power, so I just had to put up with it, which I didn't like either. But as when I became an adult, so when I was in my 20s, I got to know people in the industry, the animation industry, and I just heard all that stuff. But you were pretty free of that. Mostly you were just doing stuff for Marvel. They did have restrictions, but the restrictions weren't too bad. They had things like you couldn't say damn or hell. You can't use those words, damn or hell, and you couldn't show blood as red. It had to be black. There was kind of
that was in the 70s when I got into the business. Yeah, Dan always cautioned Craig and myself. He said, if you're going to have Conan bleed, it's just got to be like black blood. Just make it with the ink. And but that sure wasn't the case in Void Indigo. I mean, in Void Indigo, the blood was flowing like like a river.
Comic code books, though, they had up until I don't know the late 80s. They had to have the black blood because I worked at Marvel in the late 80s, and they were still doing that.
Well, actually, Barry Smith was the first one to put nipples on a bare-chested man. I mean, all the Tarzan books and everything up to that point, Khazar, these guys had pectoral muscles but no nipples. And Smith was the first one to do that. And I think because Roy Thomas was behind him, they got away with it. I don't know if Stan would have allowed it if it was just entirely up to him.
Stan was a liberal. I don't think he had a problem. It's just that the code still had power for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, the code was still very powerful in the 80s, even though it was sort of their relevance was just diminishing by the day. But their power lasted into the 90s. But I mean, in the 90s, it pretty much died off, and they disrupted. So,
can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay, I'm not seeing you.
It switches back and forth, so whoever's talking, they show that face. So, I'm on the screen.
I'm just seeing my Mac. Okay, hold on a second. I'm not sure this is easy. As long as you can hear me, right?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can see you too. You look fine.
Okay, I'm not seeing you. I'm just seeing Tatiana, which is my wife's name. It says Tatiana's MacBook Air with the Apple sign, and that's it. That's all I'm seeing. I don't know why that. Hold on a second. There we go. Okay, I see you now.
Yeah, there was a window you had to have open.
Yeah. As far I don't know what the arrangement or situation was with the Epic comic line, because once Void Indigo was canceled, it was, as far as I know, there was controversy, but I think Archie Goodwin was willing to withstand that. I think he was willing to stand up to that, but Steve was so chronic that that's ultimately what killed the stories.
Steve has always been that way. I mean, we used to have lunch every month. All of us comic writers that lived in Vegas at the time, we would get together for lunch once a month, and Steve would always be late. Always. It was funny. But I really missed the guy. He was great.
Yeah, me too.
I loved his laugh. He had a great laugh.
Yeah.
But you you also had you collaborated with Harvey Pieker also on American Splendor.
Yeah. Your voice wasn't totally synced up with your image there. Can you hear me now? Is everything okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. I think it's just the feed that you're getting, because I'm not listening to the actual video, but it sounds good on my end.
Okay. Yeah, I was living in Cleveland. When I left New York City, I went back to Ohio, but I didn't want to go back to my hometown. So I knew some people in Cleveland, and I moved there. And I was there for quite a few years, and I was only marginally aware of Harvey and his comic, and I knew it was called, you know, American Splendor, Off the Streets of Cleveland. But I didn't even know if that guy still lived in Cleveland. I mean, I knew that Crumb had done some work for his early issues, and of course Crumb was long gone, and I didn't even know if Harvey was still there. And then it must have been around 85, maybe 86, maybe 85. Someone put me in touch with Harvey, and I called him up and I said, I'd like to do some work for you. And he said, well, you know, I don't pay very much, man. And I said, well, that's okay. This is a unique opportunity. I'd like to do some just basically reality, straightforward reality type, you know, comics. And he was very adamant. He didn't want any superhero type of characterizations. He didn't want anything. He didn't want it to look like Marvel or DC comics. He wanted it to look like what was then, I think, considered underground comics, and or you know, just somebody with a straight forward style. And some of the guys that worked for him, some of the other artists did have a more cartoony approach, but it was all it all had an edge to it. It was kind of ragged style of drawing, which really lent itself to the story texture that Harvey was attempting to you know, create and weave. And so I think the first drawing I did for a story that I did for him was a 7 to 8 page story. He just would present the writer with little stick figures, and he would lay out just in little squares all the panels that would be on the page. But you basically he would give the artist leeway to extend the panels or change the shape of the panels or the size, but he did want X amount of panels because he had very specific balloons and captions in each panel that had to be there. And he would require the artist to do their own lettering too, which so you weren't making very much money working for Harvey, but it was fun, it was interesting, and I found it to be what do I want to say? It wasn't. I just found it to be kind of enlightening in a way, knowing that people were using that medium to do something other than superheroes. Because when I was a kid, my God, comics were ubiquitous, and they covered every possible subject matter you could put into a comic book. Anything that was on TV or the movies or dime novels were in comics, Westerns, detective stories, romances. And by the time I got into comics, it was pretty much the superhero ethos and mythos and motif was completely dominating the business. And so it was kind of a breath of fresh air to work with Harvey and work with someone who had he took himself very seriously. He took his writing seriously, and he did want to be considered as a, quote, serious writer. But I didn't necessarily want to get into it because of that. But I just like doing something different, something that was a little more marginal, but yet something that was being paid attention to. And so I did the first 7 or 8 page story. He liked it. And then for the next 2 or 3 years, I had a story in every issue. And then he became ill and a lot of things changed, and he decided to go just with one artist anymore. American folks per se. He was addressing a particular phase in his life, like when he had cancer and when he retired and things like that. And then of course, when they made the movie American Splendor, I think he actually made a book or wrote a story, I know, about what he went through in the making of that movie. And so yeah, and I stopped working for Harvey, I think in the late 80s, and then in the early 90s, I ran into him at a convention in San Diego, and he was very amenable, and we talked. And I told him that I was always available to do any more work for him if he wanted me to. And at the time, he was working exclusively just with one artist, a guy whose last name was Stack, and I forget his first name.
Frank Stack.
Pardon?
Frank Stack.
Frank Stack, right. And he really liked Stack's work, and that pretty much was, I think, probably the last artist that worked for him on a regular basis.
Yeah, I followed his series for uh, I guess 20 years. It lasted a long time, and only one issue came out a year, pretty much.
Yeah.
But I followed it from the Crumb era all the way up to the end. It was an interesting book.
Yeah, I thought some of those stories were excellent. I mean, there's one in particular that I really liked, and then they chose the filmmakers chose this. They chose a series of stories to put into the film and adapt to the film. And this was they had chose a story that I really liked. I forget the name of it, but it was just the name of a woman. It was and he it the story takes place in a donut shop in Cleveland. He runs into a woman he knew in high school, and he spends the day talking with her and going to her apartment and meeting her husband and so forth. And then he reflects back on where his life has gone since that time, and the disappointments life has dealt out to him. It was a very it just was a very interesting contemplative kind of little story, and I really liked it. And I was so pleased to see that the filmmakers chose that as one of the stories to put in the movie. And there were a couple of stories he did like that really kind of, they went deep. They kind of affected you. And there was one story I illustrated for him about a bus driver, because Harvey took the bus. Harvey was a cheapskate, and he didn't make much money most of his life. And he took the bus to work every day. He had a car, but the car would break down, so he would take the bus. And the bus service in Cleveland is actually pretty good. At least it was at that time. And it was the story, it was the getting on the bus and the point of view primarily from the bus driver, and commentary from the bus driver on different passengers. Like a passenger would get off and the bus driver would say, "Yeah, that damn guy," and talk about that passenger. Then another passenger would get on, and the bus driver would strike up conversations with him. It was a very funny story, and I really liked illustrating that one as well.
I got a couple questions for you from the viewers.
Okay.
Dead Punk Gage is his handle. Do you have a lot of issues when making those early Howard the Ducks? Did you get a lot of issues from, I guess, Marvel or from newsstands or whatever?
No, in fact, and I tell this story, and the more I tell it, the more I'm amazed that I can even tell it that it's true. The fact of the matter is we created that character absolutely off the cuff. Today, if you were going to introduce a new character into the Marvel universe, it would go through 10 meetings and 3 committees. And even then, if it wasn't politically correct, they'd probably reject it. This was something where Steve, the Man-Thing character, if you recall, has the ability to open portals into other dimensions. And at one point in one of the stories in Man-Thing, in Fear 19, he opens this dimension, and all these characters, all these individuals come out from all these different planets, different dimensions, different worlds. There was a Gandalf, magician type Gandalf guy. There was a Conan type guy. There was some guy he had red wings on. It was all these, but Howard the Duck came out as well. And at the time, we just wanted him as one of the creatures that emerged from this open portal to these alternate dimensions, alternate realities. And of course, he's the one that took off. There were no preliminary sketches. There was nothing to be or Roy. He just did it. And I didn't even do any particular preliminary character designs to show to Steve. Steve just described what he wanted the character to look like. I drew that, and that was it. Steve looked at it. He said, "I love this." And he had the last word on it, fortunately. And that was the end of that. Well, that was the beginning of that. And the only issue I ever had with Marvel, in fact, I really didn't have any issue with it. I did a few issues in Man-Thing with the Duck character. When Roy and people at Marvel became aware that it was gaining such popularity, they decided to launch the book with its own title, Howard the book with its own, and they didn't consider me. They went right to Frank Brunner. And a lot of times people ask me, was I offended? Was I disappointed? And the fact of the matter is I was working on other stuff. I was looking forward to other projects at the time. I really didn't think that I didn't have no idea where the character was going to go. And I just said, okay, that's how it is. And basically acquiesced to that. And then, of course, Frank Brunner and Steve worked on that for, I don't know, a couple of years. And then Brunner quit and Gene Colan took over. And that was, you can't get better than Gene Colan in those days. And then I ended up doing some fill-in issues, and I also did the newspaper strip as well. Gene Colan was working on the newspaper strip. And again, Steve was so abysmally late that Gene was losing his mind, and he quit. And Archie Goodwin called me. I was living in New York at the time, and he asked me if I wanted to pick up the strip, and it was torture because Steve was so far behind, and you can't get behind in newspaper strips. It's one thing to not make a publishing deadline for the book, but I mean, it's brutal to come up with a comic strip every day. And Steve was so far behind, and I was inking and drawing and inking that strip for, it just consumed my life. And finally, the syndicate, the comic strip syndicate, dropped it, and I was relieved, believe me. And it was then that I went on to continuity, because that was my last bit of steady income at the time in New York.
And continuity was feeding you work?
I was getting work when I was there, yeah.
I see.
I would do some comps for Neil. The procedure at the time usually was that there were a lot of different artists that Neil felt could draw fairly well, who would draw the storyboard frames, the comps, the animatics, and then Neil would ink them. Because the client, of course, wanted that look that Neil gave them. And that could only be achieved in the finishing process of the inking. So Neil always inked the stuff.
Yeah, somebody had a question for me. Do you remember Young Master from New Comics Group? No, I don't. Sorry. I don't know what that is. I think I remember New Comics Group, but there were so many of them that came out there for a while.
Who asked me that? Who asked me that?
It's Ron McCain, who's a comic artist. But the question was poised at me, but maybe you can answer it.
Well, no, bless him. I mean, that was my favorite. That is my favorite. That to me is the best work I did in comics.
Oh, you did that? Okay.
That stuff was great. I mean, I don't know if he knows the entire genesis of that. Prior to New Comics picking that up, what had happened was that Larry Hama and I did the character, and it appeared in Eerie in the Warren magazines. It appeared in Eerie, and I think once in Creepy. We did 3 stories, I think 10-page stories. Jim Warren decided he didn't want it any longer, and it just kind of sat there it just kind of disappeared for a while. And then these just when the indie publisher thing was getting started in the late 80s, some guys in San Francisco, the New Comics Group, comprised the so-called New Comics Group, picked it up. And I think we did 10 full comic book issues of that. And it was great. I mean, I really, really enjoyed that, because I got a chance. I painted all the covers. They were fully painted, illustrated covers. I got to experiment with the technique I was using for painting. The interior was all black and white and gray tones. So it gave me a lot of freedom to experiment with page layout and inking techniques. To this day, I look at the stuff and think, wow, that's good stuff. And I can't say I'm that satisfied with with the majority of the stuff I did in the past, but this stuff stands the test of time. And are we frozen again?
Yeah, there was interference that sort of stalled on you.
Okay. Did everything get across? Did everything get through?
I get cut off. You're just going on about how much you enjoyed working on that book, and you got cut off when you were making some point, which unfortunately I didn't get.
Well, I think I've made the point, which is that I really enjoyed doing that book, and that is a period of my career. When I look back at that art, I think, wow, this is good. I did a good job. That shows I actually had some talent in those days. And because when I look back on a lot of the old stuff, like any artist or anybody in the creative field, you look back on some of your old stuff and you really find it lacking, and you find it not up to the standards you might have today. So, but in this particular case, I really I think that stuff still holds up.
Yeah, Ron is a good artist, and so he apparently followed your stuff quite a bit. He's not just checked out because he had to go, but yeah, I know him from my Facebook group. Anyway, what was Dead Punk Gage also asked, what was the issue that had a Superman-like character fighting the Man-Thing? Do you remember that?
Oh, vaguely, yeah. That was another one of those characters that came through this interdimensional portal that was fighting me. Yes, I vaguely remember that. I can't comment much more past that. I mean, now that he brings it to mind, I remember it, but I don't remember anything more than that.
Yeah, that's the thing, especially, when like 20, 30 years go by, it's hard to remember details of things you worked on. You can remember that you did it, but it's not always easy to remember the exact details.
Yeah.
So you at some point in the 90s, you just sort of moved into commercial art.
Well, as you probably remember, in the mid 90s, comics really hit the skids financially, and it was just a disaster. And there were corpses floating on the water, man. I mean, it was bad. And a lot of my colleagues and compatriots were willing to stick with the business and beg for work and starve. And I was trained to do other stuff in art besides comics. And I just moved over into doing advertising work and did it for about 18, almost 20 years straight. I was out of the loop with comics. I didn't do any comic book work except for one opportunity came up, I think, in the early 2000s. Image was publishing kind of an anthology book of Western stories. And I did an 8-page story. Mike Barron wrote it, and I illustrated it. It was kind of like my story, but Mike fleshed it out for me. And it was nicely done. It was a story about this guy who this young cowboy who was on the range roping and breaking broncos. And it was a good little story. And I forget who colored it, but it was a good coloring job. And I was pretty much satisfied with that. But that was the only mainstream comic book thing I did in that entire 18-year stretch. And to tell you the truth, I was quite a bit happier there than I ever was in comics. There was no comic book politics. And when by politics, I'm not talking about Democrat, Republican. I'm talking about just the inner office bullshit, backstabbing politics that went on in that business, as you well know.
Yeah.
And as Henry Kissinger said, the smaller the organization, the greater the stakes. So you got some real despicable behavior with some people there, and people lying just to get jobs. People, telling lies about other artists that he's sick, he's not available, which is not true, just so they could get the job. It was pretty despicable. And advertising, I don't know. Advertising, of course, gets a bad rap. The thing that I liked about advertising was that there was nothing pretentious about it, and there was nothing. There was massage and went out to try to control the mind, like by just selling, buying shit they don't need. All the people I met, and they were much younger than I was, just came out of art school and they wanted to just do little movies. And that's really what good commercials are. They're like 30-second, 20-second movies. And that's really all these guys wanted to do. They just had fun doing it. And depending on the client, you could have a lot of fun doing that. Some of the shit I did for Nike was just great. It was a lot of fun to do. There was a lot of digital effects. I did some great stuff with the beer commercials. You've seen the beer commercials. They go crazy with that stuff. And all the art directors I worked with were great. I produced good work. I produced it on time. No one ever saw it, of course, except the art directors. And at that agency. And so, but I didn't care at that point. I was so kind of just not so much disillusioned, but just disinterested in comics. And I wasn't interested in competing with people that were hot stuff at Image Comics. And so it was basically, and I also made a lot more money. I was treated with a lot more respect. I was paid on time, and I was paid well. So I can't say anything bad about my advertising years. And I really had no intention of getting any sort of a working relationship back with comics anyway, until a few things. Well, you and I worked on that digital comic, The Blue Cat, and I was still doing advertising work then. And that just came out of the blue. You and I became friends, and you said, "Would you like to do this?" And I did it. And to this day, I'm not even sure if David Lloyd still has that posted. Does he?
Yes, it's still there. In fact, just heads up, everyone. We're planning to do a trade collecting those books, because it's a great series that Val and I did. We did 4 issues of it, and it's in landscape, so it's not up and down like portrait mode. It's a landscape comic, because it's designed for computer monitor screens. But it looks really great, so I'd like to get it out in print next year.
Yeah, and so I did that, and then when I moved to Texas, I met a bunch of people and then it was just about a year, or maybe even less than that, probably about 9 months before the first Guardians of the Galaxy came out, in which Howard the Duck has a cameo appearance at the very end, which then shot up my profile again. So I was getting invited to conventions and so forth and so on. But I still haven't done. I mean, I can't get arrested at Marvel, and I wouldn't want to anyway. And same thing with DC. I did do. I had a Kickstarter project that I did a few years back with another writer named Jim Barry, and he and I did this graphic novel about the Little Bighorn. It's called Of Dust and Blood. That was pretty successful. And we may do another one. We're thinking seriously about doing another one, which would be an adaptation of a Robert E. Howard story about a boxer, a bare knuckle boxer character that he had developed. A lot of people don't know that. And for those out there who are listening, Robert E. Howard did a lot more stuff than just Conan. And he did characters, he did pirates and cowboys and detectives, and he did horror stories. And this particular character, Steve Costigan, is a merchant seaman who travels around and doing bare knuckle fights at just about every port. And it's a great character. It's kind of a cross between Little Abner and Conan, because Steve Costigan isn't the brightest guy in the world, but he's awfully damn tough and strong. And I think the stuff's just tailor-made for comics. I mean, it writes itself. You know, Howard choreographs these fights. It's just terrific. And also, when Howard was we want to stick with the language Howard uses in the dialogue, because, you know, back in the 1930s, you couldn't use any kind of profanity in those pulp novels, and so they had to come up with all these epithets that were just, I can't think of one right now, but they're funny, they're hilarious stuff. So we're intending to do that early into 2019, starting a crowdfunding, probably a Kickstarter project for that. But other than that, I've just been doing a lot of painting, and you know, and I was listening to some previous interviews, and I've been reading interviews and talking with other comic book friends of, you know, comic book professionals that I've known over the years, and it suddenly struck me that these people really care. And I have to you know, confess, I never really did. I liked it. I read comics as a kid. I liked comics as a even in college, and of course, it afforded me a way to have a living and a reputation, and develop a professional standing in a business. And I appreciate all that, and believe me, I feel like I'm blessed to have that. On the other hand, it doesn't break my heart that I don't do comics anymore. And I know for people like, well, for instance, Craig Russell, and I'm not telling tales out of school. I hope Craig doesn't, if he ever hears this, doesn't get upset. But the fact of the matter is, when Dan Adkins submitted our samples to Marvel, my attitude was, well, hey, if this works, great. If this doesn't work, I got to go on to something else. I mean, I was into martial arts at the time. I was help running a martial arts school. I thought, well, maybe I'll try to make some money at that. I mean, I was pretty cavalier about it. And then when we finally did get accepted, when the word came down that Roy Thomas liked our stuff and was going to assign stories to us, we were of course both very, very excited about this. And Craig asked me, what would you have done if we weren't accepted? And I said, geez, I don't know. I would have done something. And Craig said, I would have slit my wrists. And so, you know, and a lot of the people that I talk to that have been into comics or have wanted to get into comics now or have been in comics, they really have a, wow, did you hear that?
Yeah, you flashed on the screen too. We could see it in the window.
Yeah. These people have a lot of people in the business have had a yearning, just this burning desire to get their hands on a character like Batman. Oh, what I could do with Batman, you know, artists and writers. And I never had that drive. I never had that. It did not subsume my life in that way.
Me neither.
You know, I like the medium, and I think comics are really a fascinating medium. They're a fascinating aspect of our culture. I think they pretty much got invented in America, like rock and roll and jazz. And but quite honestly, unless it's a story I really like, I find them tedious. I would rather work on one painting, one illustration, as opposed to breaking down a page. That's why I like working with good writers, because like you, Steve, Mike Barron, it's panel 1, this is happening. Panel 2, this is happening. I don't particularly want that. That's fine with me. I don't particularly want to spend the time breaking down a page and figuring out what the writer wants. That's why I liked advertising as well. It's like, okay, this is going to be 10 frames explaining why we're going to, you know, sell, these kids love Air Jordan shoes, and it was just panel 1, frame 1, frame 2, and I'm a very collaborative kind of worker. I like that. At the same time, so I like the medium. I like the form. I like the way the medium works. I like that it's a combination of words and pictures. But as far as having this deep passion for it, I guess it was never there. Doesn't mean I don't like comics. Doesn't mean I don't like the fans. I mean, I really enjoy going to the shows. But I have to honestly say that it does not occupy the place in my consciousness that I think it has in with many people of my generation and then our predecessors. I wouldn't have, no matter how successful I ever got at comics, I wouldn't be out starting my own comic book company like they did at Image. You know, it just wouldn't occur to me. It just wouldn't.
Yeah, well, in my case, I never wanted to. I mean, I didn't mind. I liked the idea of doing a Superman story or Batman story, but I never wanted to do that for like a year or something. I feel weird working on other people's characters. It's like they're not my characters. I want to do something of mine that's original, and I believe that comics needs new stuff. It doesn't need the same stuff over and over and over again, and it's really I think held back the industry, that it's been like just mainly in service to like a handful of characters that have just been the only main, you know, thing for the industry for like decades. Now it's sort of fragmenting and there's doing other stuff, but you know, for a while there, when I started out, publishers, I mean, comic stores didn't want to buy a book that wasn't Marvel or DC. In fact, there were some stores that only carried Marvel books in the early 80s, which is crazy. They were just run by fanboys. You know?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's, you know, I think it's healthy for people to do something of their own, and I've recommended to anybody that'll listen to me that if you do comics, you should do your own characters.
Yeah, I had a character that, well, I still have a character. I have some stuff in my files way back there, and in my flat files, I have some comic book pages that I did on my own of a particular character. It would have no major commercial appeal right now. I don't even know what I'll do with it if I'll ever present it. I used to be an actor. I still do some acting, but I was a very active actor. I went to New York City, not just to further my career in comics and to meet and work with Neil Adams and all that, but I went there to study acting. I did some off Broadway stuff. And whenever I get the idea of a story, I think of making a little film about it, as opposed to a comic, because these days it's so much easier to make a film than it ever was. You know, the digital technology allows people to literally do a production that looks like it was done that 20 years ago would have cost you would have had to rent all this film equipment and huge crews and sound people. And so it doesn't occur to me it's not that I dislike comics, but I just don't. It's not my first go-to thing. It's like, oh, if I want to tell a story, if I want to get something across, if I want to indicate something about my worldview or something, I'm going to do it in a comic book. No, it just doesn't occur to me. And I know it has to a lot of people. I mean, there are people in this business that they just can't wait to get their opinion about what the world's about out there in the public. You know, it's rather narcissistic, but you know, it's a medium that lends itself to that, certainly.
Well, that's entertainment for you. I mean, a lot of people are like that in entertainment, no matter what level it is. It's like when I lived in LA, I would go see a movie. If you go to see a movie in LA, a lot of the people in the audience are people that work in the movie business. So people coming out like hairdressers or grips or something, complaining about, you know, the lighting on that scene could have been better if they moved the lights over to the left, or, you know, I mean, like, you just hear everyone is like criticizing what they know, and it's, you know, it's but it's, you know, it's just human nature, I guess. I mean, I like to every writer writes what their personal animus is, you know, the thing that drives them. That's the thing that they like to write about. But, you know, some of us are more interested in entertaining the audience rather than making it a soapbox about their own personal views. And I am one of those people that I don't like being preached to. I want to be entertained. If you expect me to pay money for your stuff, you better dance, fool, because, you know, I'm not gonna come back if you don't entertain me. So I feel, as a consumer, I try to have empathy for the consumer of my books, and I try to give them what I feel is worthwhile for them.
Yeah, I firmly agree with that. The few things that I have done in the past few years, I did just so people might get a kick out of it. I was posting stuff on Facebook for a while, about 2 years ago. Consistently, I did 3 or 4 little postings, 3 or 4 little chapters of Howard the Duck going back in time with Man-Thing. I don't know if you saw any of those.
I don't think I did.
And it was just little riffs on, well, first of all, he was going back in time because of, again, Man-Thing had this ability to not just open up portals, but he could go back in time. I don't know if Steve ever decided that's what he could do, but I decided that's what he could do. So they go back in time. He wants to go to Paris to meet Hemingway. Howard does. He wants to go back and meet cultural figures that were of some importance way before all the bullshit that's going on now in the culture and politics. So they goof, and they end up going back during the French Revolution, and they're and then following, he gets to Paris in the 20s, and he meets Gertrude Stein and Hemingway, and Howard starts flirting with Alice B. Toklas, who was Gertrude Stein's lover, but Howard being totally oblivious that they're lovers, and it's an interspecies thing. He thinks she rejects him because he's a duck, and I'm just going on, just riffing on this stuff because I think then he meets Richard Burton. He goes off to a John Huston film set, and on Night of the Iguana, and Howard gets drunk with Richard Burton, and Richard Burton goes on these tirades while he's drunk. And this was stuff that people found really funny, and it's got nothing to do with what I think about the world. I just think this is a great little character that I like reading authors and seeing films from those periods too. So I'm putting Howard in scenarios that I would have liked to have been in. I would have liked to have spent time talking to Hemingway and so. And I'm going to have when I get the time, I'm going to have one of Howard hanging out with Jack Kerouac, and that's going to be really fun on the road. And then I'm going to have Howard actually go back just to the 80s and meet Harvey Pekar and have a big argument with Pekar about what comics are about. And I think that's what I think people. I would get a kick out of reading that, and I would get a kick out of, and so that's why I'm writing it. I think people are going to get, and they have responded very positively. They get a few chuckles out of it, and people are saying like, finally someone's doing something with that character that's interesting, as opposed to what Marvel's doing with that character, which is shit. They redesigned him, and the stories suck. He looks like a pigeon. I mean, it looks like that pigeon's head on a dwarf's body. It's just ridiculous. It's not a dwarf. What's the who was Frodo and what a hobbit? Yeah, it's like a pigeon's head on a hobbit's body. So yeah, I hear you about it being entertaining. Yeah, it's just take that character and do something with it that if nothing else gives people a few laughs.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, it's not a difficult character, but it's one of those things where people, if they don't get it, they just try to do their own thing. It's as a writer, I can tell you it's frustrating to go into a book to follow somebody or have somebody follow you or watch other people do it to other people. But what they do is somebody takes over a book and they just want to get rid of everything that the previous guy did because they want to make it about them.
Yeah.
All about them and their views, and they're just going to trash everything that went on before, not because it would be a good idea. On the other hand, there's sometimes it is a good idea to trash what went on before, but that's a different story. But I mean, yeah, it's a shame when it's all about people's egos and everything.
Yeah, and I think sometimes a character is due to evolve. I think when Neil Adams did Batman, it was time for Batman to look a little more realistic, for Batman to be a little grittier. And then, there's pros and cons as to what Miller did with Batman. But once the genie was out of the bottle, it's just like, then people went nuts. Then supposedly, pull out all the stops and everything's okay with Batman. It doesn't matter what you do with him. It just, in fact, the more crazy it is, supposedly the more people are going to like it. Well, I don't think that's the case.
Yeah. So now you're sort of focusing on projects. I know you and I are talking about a project that we're hoping to do next year. That's going to be a fun superhero thing. We're just waiting for some elements to come together for that. But yeah, I mean, it's great that you're doing stuff. I mean, your stuff has improved a lot over the years, and I know you have a lot of fans that like your stuff. A lot of people have mentioned to me that they were really wanted to see this interview, and it kept getting stalled by technical issues. In fact, a couple of people who are artists, they wanted to tell you how much they loved, that little Bighorn comic. I mean, they thought it was outstanding.
Well, great. That's good to hear. Also, there's a graphic novel publisher, ABM. I don't know if you've heard of them. They besides the books that we actually had printed up ourselves, and they now are distributing the book all over the world. So that's been great. It's going to be translated into different languages. It'll be sold in Europe and Japan, and that's pretty exciting. Jim and I didn't expect that to happen, but it did. Jim just happened to contact them out of on a whim, and they were suddenly interested. So that's been good. Where that book is available now, I don't know. I mean, but any place that sells graphic novels probably would have it, Of Dust and Blood. But yeah, I'm doing a lot of painting now. I do Western art. I have horses. I love horses. I've always been into horses. As you can see right here is a painting of a polo player. I used to play polo. I love it. I love horses. I love the games and the sports that horses are involved in. and I'm represented by a gallery in Fort Worth that does primarily Western, that exhibits primarily Western art. I am doing what I've done is when the guy at the gallery found out, he liked my art, my Western stuff. When he found out that I worked for comic books, he was really enthralled because he had been a fan when he was a kid. He's about my age, or maybe your age. And the thing is that no other, gallery people are kind of snooty, they're kind of snobbish, and nobody else would have come up with this idea. But he took the chance. He said, look, you used to do sci-fi stuff, adventure stuff, comic book stuff. Somehow integrate that into your Western work. And I had no idea what that would be. And then it occurred to me, I just had this idea of cowboys roping a dinosaur. And I did this huge painting, like a 4-foot by 5-foot painting of about 6 or 7 cowboys. It's about 6 or 7 cowboys roping a Tyrannosaurus. I took it up to his gallery, and people went crazy. They just loved it. It was something they were just not used to seeing at a typical Western art gallery. So now I'm working on a whole series of these paintings, which I'm also going to start posting on Facebook and my website. And he's making prints of them, selling the prints, and it may even lead to a story, maybe a graphic novel about cowboys and dinosaurs. And I don't know how or why. Don't ask me how and why cowboys got together with dinosaurs. I don't know. We'll think of something. But so that's been fun. Just fortunately, I've been very blessed that I could do more than just draw comics, and I have been really having a great time with painting, which is what I went to art school for 50 years ago anyway. And because when I was in art school, I wanted to be the next Frank Frazetta. All I could think of was just, how beautifully this guy painted stuff. And then all the great illustrators that have followed in his stead and in his, in that genre have always inspired me. So.
Yeah, he's great. Well, we got to wrap it up because it's getting late for me. I'm sure it's late for you. I got to get up and go to work tomorrow. So
yeah, sure.
It was great talking to you. And I'm sure the audience here really appreciated it. And yeah, it's really good, and I'd certainly like to do it again. And what I really like to do is get on a couple people beside, gets like a couple artists together, and you can all talk to each other about stuff. Because
that'd be great.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Well, good. Well, whoever's listening, thank you. Thanks for your time and your attention. I appreciate it. And keep listening to the James's stuff. He's doing great interviews, man. He's doing good. I've enjoyed those. The ones you did. Who was the guy that came in he came in while you were interviewing Mike Barron, and then you.
Oh yeah, Todd Mulrooney. He's a younger artist, and he did the cover to my Secrets of Writing book, and he's a good artist.
He really had a lot of stuff to ask, good questions. He had good things to say. He's obviously given a lot of thought into, being a comic book artist and doing things in an interesting way and getting his work out there. And I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, that's the thing. What I'm trying to do with this series is a little bit different than what other people are doing. Besides just talking about stuff, and I just like a more honest exchange about things and reminiscing on stuff and just like insights into the business that people don't normally get. I like just saying how it really is, so people kind of have a better sense of what it's really about, and just kind of it's just more interesting for me to cover things that other people don't cover.
Yeah. I think the artists and writers appreciate that as well, because there are so many pat questions that you're going to get at conventions, panels, and so forth that you're tired of. And I don't get tired of talking about the advent of the duck, and I don't get tired about telling how Craig and I got into the business with Dan, because that's very nostalgic for me. And I think back on that, very, very. It's very pleasant to revisit that. But a lot of the stuff that they talk about, that the questions you're asked, it's just it's the same stuff.
Yeah, I'm just bored with the Pat stuff. And, oh, by the way, I really would like to talk to Craig and get him on here too. So maybe we can get both of you on sometime.
Oh, that'd be great. I
Yeah.
love it.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks for the interview, and hopefully we'll be talking again soon.
Okay, you're welcome. Thanks. Take care, man.
Take care.